We heard how 90% of the world's water footprint is tied up in supply chains and the need to both manage the outgoing and incoming risks to that water use. And we heard how mobilising the power and the finance of the private sector can provide a formidable opportunity for improving water resource management, unlocking stagnating IWRN processes, and influencing governance. Good example for that, Tanzania Breweries Limited, which is the part owned by SAB Miller, is the biggest taxpayer in Tanzania. So getting those kinds of people in the room with the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Water to talk about investment in water resource management is not to be sniffed at. But this area is also full of controversies. Peter did a very eloquent job of setting those out this morning or hinting at those. You know, private sector companies by their very nature are legally obliged to serve the needs of a small group of shareholders or owners, often distant from where water is being used in the supply chain. So involving that kind of private interest in the management of the ultimate public resource, which is water, is wick with problems. Because we can't guarantee the neutrality of those corporate actors. We also have the launch of DFID's new investment in the International Water Stewardship Programme, £10 million with funding over the next 6 years to support this greater level of engagement with the private sector. The evidence base for that, to my mind, is still quite thin, and why that's a good idea. We don't know what works and how it should work. In certain parts of the world, El Salvador last week, interestingly, actually banned any corporate involvement in water at all, seeing it as too greater a risk to the public interest. Yeah? And we'll hear later on, I think, from Janek how corporate engagement can lead to or expose us to the risk of capture of policy, capture of people, capture of water. So what we need to do, and the challenge before us, is to make sure that this new corporate engagement agenda leads to water security for all, rather than water securitization for a few. And to help unpack all that, we've got a formidable panel of global experts on this agenda. I'm very pleased to say we've got, on my left, the heads of 3 key initiatives on corporate engagement. Cate Lamb, who's director of the Carbon Disclosure Project's water programme. And I'll let Cate quote the staggering figure of investment that you now influence for your questionnaire. We've got Sabine von Wiren-Lehr, who is director of the European Water Stewardship Initiative, part of the Alliance for Water Stewardship. Sabine's team are actually out there doing the job of certifying water stewards under the water stewardship standard. So we've got some interesting experience from that perspective. And then we've got Hermann-Friede, who co-leads an initiative to look at the impact and integrity of water stewardship initiatives globally. The way the session is going to work is we'll give each of the speakers 10 to 12 minutes. I've asked them to introduce the initiative and to try and tease out how it contributes to greater water equity. Yeah? And then to think about what else needs to happen in order to galvanise that contribution, particularly given that we're here at the UK Water Forum, from a UK actors perspective. So that's not Hugh Grant and Helen Mirren, that's UK government, UK companies, UK investors, UK researchers, and UK consumers, and to pose the question, is there a role that they need to make that isn't yet being delivered on? So without further ado, Cate Lamb.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm sorry I had to miss this morning's session. I heard it was amazingly interesting, and I'm disappointed that I missed Tony talking, but hopefully we can catch up soon. So Nick invited me along today as we head to discuss the role of corporations in safeguarding water resources and enhancing water equity. It is a controversial issue. We're well aware of that. But I want to state up front that I think all 3 panel members share the same objectives as everybody else in the room. So we want to make sure that we are getting it right. And I'm definitely open for challenge on some of these issues, if you do in fact believe that we are not quite there yet, and how we might be able to do things in a much more streamlined way. But I do believe I want to impress you in the next 10 minutes. So for those of you who are perhaps not aware of who CDP is, please don't feel bad. We've just been branded by the Harvard Business Review as the most influential NGO that you've probably never heard of. So I think that's a compliment. I'm going to take it as one anyway. We have been operational now for about 14 years. We leverage the power of the markets to drive corporations and cities to behave more responsibly in the sense of reducing their environmental impact and taking actions to manage that. So I'm the Global Director of the Water Programme, and whose vision is to catalyse corporate action towards water stewardship in order to safeguard water resources. As I mentioned, we use the power of disclosure and transparency to drive change. We believe fundamentally that information and data will transform the economy, and enabling access to that information to the right actors in the right way at the right time will lead to changes in behaviour that will ultimately safeguard water resources, prevent dangerous climate change, and prevent deforestation, which are our other two programmes. We leverage that power of the investors and purchasing organisations to drive corporations to be more transparent with data that they've perhaps never really considered important before. And in fact, in the case of the water programme, it's data that has never really existed before and doesn't exist anywhere else. I'm very proud of that. We take that information and we feed it back into the marketplace, and I'll tell you a few ways in which we do that in a moment. So we now operate through the water programme on behalf of 573 investors with $63 trillion worth of assets. It's massive, isn't it? It's quite impressive. And it's those large numbers that encourage companies such as Olam, Chris I'm sure can attest to this, to really pay attention to the work that we do and to provide the information that we're asking for. In addition to those investors, we also operate a supply chain program where we have companies such as Unilever, Dell, L'Oreal, British American Tobacco, Ford, working with CDP to issue our water questionnaire to a selection of their suppliers, because they've seen the transformational power of just receiving some of these questions that we pose to them may also drive real good transformation within their supply chain and ultimately build more resilient supply chains. Again, really quite impressive numbers. We have a range of tools at our disposal alongside those big numbers and very proactive investors and supplier purchasing companies. The first is our questionnaire, which on its own, without anything else, poses probably one of the most influential opportunities for CDP at driving behaviour change. By posing what on the face of it appears to be relatively simple questions, such as, are you exposed to water-related risk? It drives a transformation within that company. It causes a reaction. They go and gather data that they've perhaps never realised they even had before. They go and find out where the keys to the meter rooms are. They go and map their river basins. They develop a deeper understanding of where they're operating, why they're operating, and what the implications of that operation are to those other actors within their watershed. They collect this information, they put it in a standardised format to us, and they report to us on an annual basis. So alongside that questionnaire, we also issue a letter to the chairman of every company, demanding, demanding with the lowercase d in a very polite way, that they provide us with this information. In addition to this, we then score and rank companies based on the quality of the disclosure, so the usefulness of the information that they've provided to us. We want to cut out all of the waffle and get to the nub of the issue, but also on their performance, and its performance with a lowercase p at this stage. We're not looking at how much water a company is reducing, no longer consuming. We're not yet looking at how much they've reduced their polluting load from across their supply chain, for example, although we would like to move in that direction into the future. What we're focusing on right now is the quality and robustness of their risk assessments, how clear and inclusive those processes have been, the quality of their policies and procedures that they have in place to safeguard water resources, who has responsibility for water, for example, across the organisation. We take those scores and we load them onto Bloomberg terminals and Google Finance and other indexes that are created that publicly highlight and reward those companies that are doing well, but also shines the light on those companies that are perhaps not doing so well or have some way to go. It's an incredibly powerful lever for change. We have workshops where we have 120 companies in the room wanting to know, how do we improve our score? And of course, we're so clever at CDP that we've designed a scoring methodology that the only way you can improve your score is by disclosing better, more useful information and managing water better, which is great. We then have the data. We've been operating for 5 years now within the water programme, and we've now collected the world's largest database of primary corporate water data that, as I said earlier, doesn't exist anywhere else. Please use it. CDP reports, we launch a number of reports throughout the year that basically state the state of environment, and we highlight best practice or good practice in those and highlight areas for improvement. Then when we create alliances, it's critically important to us that we know that we can't change. This is a huge challenge. We can't do this alone. We're working with pretty much everyone on the table, probably a few of you in the room as well. We've got alliances with WWF, CWRN, any NGO with a 3, 4 or 5 letter acronym, we're working with them, as well as Water Witness. So this year we've issued the questionnaire to 2,100 companies worldwide. And they're not utility companies. These are companies that use and have a dependency upon water, whether that's in their direct operations or their supply chain. There's a selection of them on the right-hand side of the slide there. That's not exhaustive. There's an exhaustive list on the website. I'm currently fundraising. We are a charity, as we said, so I'm currently fundraising to allow us to expand into other critical regions where water is posing a challenge to their economic success. My target is over about 5,000 companies in around 2 years will be confronted with the questionnaire and then will be scored on their response. So I was asked what is this role, what role does CDP have really in contributing to advancing water equity? And it came at a very pertinent time. We've just finished a piece of work with WaterAid, who came to our office for about a month and looked through our data, read every response that has been given to us, to understand the corporate attitude to WASH, whether they view it as a strategic issue or not, whether they even recognise that they have a responsibility to take action on it. And these are the findings from that analysis. So basically, few companies consider WASH-related issues as part of their risk assessment process. In fact, only the numbers are quite small, 7% of risks that were reported to us, and we had about 950 risks in total. Only 7% of those were WASH-related, which indicates, in our opinion, that companies are not necessarily looking at this. Not that it doesn't indicate that it's not a risk. I think I want to be clear here. Secondly, few companies consider that WASH-related issues as presenting them with an opportunity to enhance their brand value or to enhance their workforce, look after their workforce, secure their own licenses to operate. In fact, again, only a very low proportion, only 6% of companies recognise that it might actually be a way in which they can enhance their business. And perhaps as a result of those low those low figures, corporate action on WASH really is not seen as a priority issue. Only 5% of companies really integrate WASH into their targets and goals or policies. And in fact, most of the times when WASH was talked about or mentioned in any response, it was sort of ad hoc all over the place and with no real strategic value. So off the back of this, we thought, well, what can CDP do really to enhance this and raise awareness of this amongst corporations and help them understand that it really is a strategic opportunity for them? So we developed this questionnaire and we've refined it so that we now ensure that that corporate risk assessments are robust and do consider the broader actors in the watersheds, that it moves companies beyond just a compliance-based volumetric sort of quite simple approach to water risk assessment, but instead does consider the broader context. And we asked them, if you can get our questionnaire online for free, so you can have a dig around and you can see what I mean on that. Inadequate access to WASH is positioned really within the way in which we structure the questionnaire as an opportunity and a risk. So companies, when they fill in the questionnaire, they'll be confronted with that option to choose or make them think about it. Through scoring and through the questions that we ask, we reward companies that acknowledge the human right to water in a public policy. That's new for the first time this year, so it'll be interesting to see the impact of that and what it means, and ultimately, is it driving to meaningful contributions from these corporations? And finally, this issue of policy capture, we want to shine the light on that as an issue. So we're asking companies whether they've aligned their public policy positions with their water stewardship goals. Our experience on climate change is that companies are saying that they absolutely believe in climate change, they're contributing to it, and they've got a role to mitigate it, but then their public policy teams are going off and lobbying against stronger environmental climate change legislation. By shining a light on this, even if it's a sort of a small step at the moment, it's an important one, I think, and one that could lead to some quite exciting opportunities for us. But we're not about just driving good disclosure, we are about catalysing action. And many of our investors really do have an interest in this issue, and they recognise that it does pose a threat to their portfolio companies. This is a quote from the Interfaith Centre for Corporate Responsibility, which is a consortium of around about 50 US investors. And they believe that the company's participation in CDP's water programme will help to ensure the right to water for current and future generations. So what needs to happen next to advance water equity and quality? Well, CDP, and ideally with your help, needs to expand our reach and continue to increase our impact. We want to confront more and more companies with these questions, so that they're compelled to take action and to really think about that action and the contribution that they're making. We think the researchers, policymakers, and CDP and other NGOs in the room and beyond, we need to start strengthening the business case around why this issue is strategic and important to companies. And importantly, we need to prove that good water stewardship drives impact reduction, which in turn drives risk mitigation, which then ultimately drives a successful business. And the more evidence we've got to prove that, the easier it will be to convince all the other companies who are still at the very early stages of saying, what the hell is water got to do with my business? I don't use that much of it. It will make a much more compelling argument. We need more tools, guidance, suites of support that we can offer these corporations to ensure that they are taking the right interventions. In the main, companies that are spending money on WASH and are making claims on this issue, they do want to make sure that it stands up to scrutiny. You know, they don't want to be in the headlines seeing that this is actually a false economy, that they're not making the right investments. I think we need to embrace that and think about the opportunities that presents to all of us. And finally, I think in the UK specifically, I've been to so many presentations and workshops and meetings where the focus has been on the utility providers and the role that they have to play in safeguarding water resources and other things. I think we need to broaden our horizons, view the corporation as a very significant opportunity to assist us, given the right frameworks, the right structures, and CDP keeping score, to assist us in our endeavours. Thank you very much.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Cate. I'll hand straight over to Sabine to talk about the work of the Alliance for Water Stewardship and European Water Partnership within that.
Yes. Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure for me to represent here the Alliance of Water Stewardship and its regional representations. At the moment, we have regional representations in Europe, North and South America, as well as in Australia. Very briefly on the organization itself, it was a merging thing around 2007-2008, when we had different stewardship initiatives in different parts of the world. Mainly in Australia, the European Water Stewardship Initiative also coming up in Europe with this background of the Water Framework Directive. And then in the US, TNC and WWF thinking about setting up a round table to set up a standard for water stewardship. So these initiatives gathered and said, well, we want to avoid a situation that we might know out of the carbon sector, different standards, different data settings, and so on. So let's gather and see and make at least sure that the different systems we have, because water management means local impact, different local necessities. We want to consider that, but nevertheless make sure that we are all in line and work together, and we don't end up with different systems. So that's the Alliance of Water Stewardship, and maybe the most tangible outcomes of the work of this alliance are the water stewardship standards. Currently we have two. We have the International Water Stewardship Standard, which has been recently launched, and we have one customized water stewardship standard, which is mainly focusing on the implementation in Europe. And I would like to highlight a bit these standards and how standards can be tools for this guidance to go towards water stewardship. But before we do that, I would like to dig with you a bit on this principle of water stewardship, because we've heard a lot the term. Maybe it's worth it just to look a bit beyond and to say, what is it tackling? Well, water stewardship is a very generic approach. It's a generic approach. It's a cross-sector approach. It's not bound to any size, to any kind of an enterprise. And it tackles all the issues that you might find in the river basins of the world. Water stewardship asks a water user to recognize its impacts in a local context. So the baseline is the river basin context, and it has also to do with the recognition of a water user that you never use water alone. That sounds quite simple, but when you go on a production site, it's really that. You start with that. You say, please, you have to see your local impact, and you have to recognize you don't use your water alone. You are always in a river basin context. So with that, you ask for an integrative perspective. Sounds also still quite reasonable. So when you come to the ground, and it might be a farm, that can be also an industrial production site. We heard it already this morning. What you might find is that the farm has already established some efficiency measures, technological innovations, drip irrigation, all in fence. So when this farmer now wants to go for water stewardship, this means that at this farm they have to spread out. They have to look at the river basin level for their impact, and then they come up exactly at that point that we also heard this morning from Sab Miller, that you have to recognize you have shared risks. You have a lot of risks that you can't handle on your own, but that you share with the other water users in the river basin. Fortunately, you don't have only shared risk, you have also shared opportunities. So that's really one point also of water stewardship. It is like tackling these risks, finding mitigation strategies in this river basin contexts. And to make managers of production sites understand that through that you can only achieve a sustainable management of your resource, and with that a long-term economic robustness. Also a farmer wants to produce. It's an economic factor. So when we stay at this example of a farm, and when we bind it then, or when we break that down on two very normal requests, like have a look at water quantitative aspects, so how much do you withdraw, and on water quality, we see that it gets really complex for a farmer. So we go at a farm and then we say, okay, you have a high use efficiency, but now you have to think about where does your water come from. And not only that, you have also to know, is this source sensitive or not? You have maybe to think about alternative sources. In terms of water quality, you have different potentials for pollutions. And we ask not only for that, we ask also to avoid and minimize them, and to make an impact assessment and so on. So all I want to show here is it's quite complex. This is really a complex issue, and that is exactly where the standards jump in. That is exactly the benefit of a standard. It translates theory and complexity into a practical approach. Yeah? This is how we see the role of these standards. It facilitates this complex risk analysis, and it gives you a performance analysis. When you go step by step through the requirements, it's not only because you want to get certified, it's because you ask the right questions, yeah, inside your operation. And then a standard also provides you the incentive that you can measure your improvement. Because when you do something, it's also nice to see how you improve. And some want to disclose this improvement within a certification. I would really like to stress here that standards are not only a tool for certification. For us, in our understanding, really the main incentive and then the main benefit in applying a standard is really in the beginning. It is really this kind of guideline aspect and this capacity building aspect. And then, last but not least, having a standard, we have heard that, we can link now to the CDP reporting. We can link at production sites with ISO 40001 standards. So a standard provides you also the place to link water management to different other environmental structures that you have in place. When you think, for example, in your projects, in like applying a standard, I would also ask you to ask always to look behind the standard how it has been developed. Because you can develop a standard, you write it down as an expert, it's not a problem. But stewardship has to do with ownership. You want to create ownership. So the stewardship standards have been developed in international multi-stakeholder committees within years. Because it's about like discussing what should be in, how should it be implemented, and so on. Another point is applicability. So before these standards are launched, they are implemented, now I have to click a lot, they are implemented in many different conditions and in a lot of different operations of the world. Because you don't want to create an academic thing, you want to create something that is useful for different operations and different sectors in any part of the world. And at the moment, the European standard has served to about 10 certification and hundreds of implementations within Europe. The international standard is still in the project phase, in the piloting phase, and will then now start with the certifications. When we go, pardon? 3 minutes, no problem. So when we go in the contents, just to see that. Water stewardship, what is it? So in a way we framed it around 4 principles. You have to see that you achieve a sustainable water balance. That means not only amount, I want to stress that it's also timing of your water, when you take your water off, and this, in regard to the sensitivity of your sources. It's establishing a good water quality status. We ask, what's your contribution to the chemical status of the water in the river basin? It's a healthy status of important water-related areas. What's that? I mean, these are high conservation value areas around in your river basins with social value or with biodiversity value. And then there is a big portion of water governance that we also ask. And when we have, for example, corporates, who are defining, just developing a water management strategy, and they come and they ask, what should be in our water management strategy at corporate level? We say, make sure that you cover all these 4 principles. So don't stay only on reduction goals, cover also water governance in your corporate strategy. When it comes then to the ground, that means that you first bring your house in order. We had the farmer putting the drip irrigation, using efficiently the water. Then you go into watershed interaction and in value chain improvements. For the watershed interactions, we had already some examples. You do a source vulnerability assessment, a water body impact assessment that you see how you contribute to the water status. You see what is around as ecosystems, and in governance, we have a lot of issues going for transparency, stakeholder involvement, and also what we call local deals. We ask simply the questions, do you see opportunities in smart investments together with others in your river basin to mitigate your water risks? That causes then a kind of a continuous improvement. In a way, with water stewardship, you never finish. You are never at a kind of an end, because you set your plans. Very important, we ask for water management strategies at every level, also at a farmer level. Also, a farmer should have a kind of an idea, where do I want to be in 5 years? What risks do I have in a river basin? And how do I want to address these risks? Then it goes in an implementation and, very important, in an evaluation phase. So with the last slide, I wanted to come back to these questions, how these standards can go and how they can support water equity. And well, I would say our answer would be from the Alliance of Water Stewardship. It's first of all, it's really in the basic of this idea of water stewardship. This river basin approach doesn't give you a choice. You have to respect who is around. And then also this requirement to think beyond water quantity and quality and to take governance explicitly into account is also kind of supporting directly water equity. And then we have, and here I need very quickly some examples. Then we have in the standard itself really concrete indicators that are asking for equity. We had today, this morning, for example, legal compliance. So in the water stewardship standards, you have these questions. Yeah? Do you comply with water-related legal and regulatory requirements? And I can say that you don't have always to go in third countries and outside of Europe to make this question an interesting one. You can also stay within Europe and ask this question. There is, for example, also one indicator that I really wanted to emphasize, that is the question on shared infrastructure. We have, when you deliver all your wastewater or a good part of your wastewater in a public wastewater treatment plant, I mean, you can say, I have a contract, that's their thing, what their performance is. We say, as a water steward, you can't get rid of this requirement. You can't get rid of this, of your responsibility. So you have to ask your wastewater treatment plant about their performance. And we had here, for example, especially smaller entities, smaller operations have difficulties to ask their wastewater treatment plant. So we have set up a guidance document of questions to ask to wastewater treatment plants. And yeah, so we have WASH indicators also in the standards, and we have clear indicators where we ask for stakeholder involvement. A last word before Nick goes crazy here. A last word on how we think we should go further, that we really can leverage a good impact. First of all, we think that the uptake should move from voluntary work from some companies, corporates, towards really a kind of an awareness rising at the consumer and at the investor side. We see that consumers still do not ask for water stewardship or sustainable water management actions. Then certainly we should have much more sectors involved. We see here in the water stewardship community a strong concentration on different sectors. And last but not least, that these standards really stay good tools. We have to bring in the exercise or the experience, the lessons learned from the ground. We have to bring them back to the standard. Thanks a lot.
Great stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sabine. Great stuff. So we're going to pan out a little bit now, and Janek, I'm sorry I didn't indicate that you're program manager with the Water Integrity Network, co-managing a study on the integrity of water stewardship initiatives in the whole. So the kind of work we just heard about, but also looking at some of the multi-stakeholder convening work that the Water Resources Group, 2013 Water Resources Group, has been doing. I won't steal your thunder. So without further ado.
Thanks a lot, Nick. Hi, everybody. I hope you can still bear with me for a few minutes on the third presentation directly after lunch. So I will try to make it exciting. It's great to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. As mentioned, I work for the Water Integrity Network, but maybe first I'll just point to the partners that we're implementing this project with. It's co-managed with the CO Water Mandate, so we have the link to the UN Global Compact, and it's facilitated both financially and with lots of input content-wise from GIZ. In addition to that, we're implementing the project with Water Witness International, BPD, and Pegasus, which is based in South Africa. That just to start out with, I'm very happy that we had an extensive introduction to what water stewardship is already, but just to see what we're looking at here is when mentioning water stewardship initiatives, we really want to look at a bit more formalized types of engagement of corporate actors in multi-stakeholder settings. I will leave it at that and not confuse you more with different definitions that I could pull out of my arm. But so that you know what we're aiming to do is, and I would like to spend a couple of words on that. We seek to establish a practical framework for ensuring high levels of integrity in such geographical types of engagement of corporate actors. And I'll spend a few more words throughout the presentation on what this practical could actually look like, because when we're talking about partnership initiatives, management thereof on the ground is a tricky thing in itself for the different dynamics that you will encounter in different types of partnerships. And what we want to eventually come up with is basically a management approach that helps to improve the impact and effectiveness of such partnerships through higher levels of integrity. So here just please note that we're trying to actually achieve something concrete with integrity, which relating to what Roger said before the break is almost as abstract as capacity building. And to make the link to today's event, basically the idea is that that will of course then contribute to more equitable water management, because discrimination and corruption are two things that are very closely linked. The biggest challenge that we faced when we started this work was, and this was also the first question that we got from our very wise and experienced advisory board, is what are you actually talking about when you talk about integrity in water stewardship initiatives? And here's our current working definition. Maybe as a side note, where I'm trying to talk about this work fairly continuously to get feedback, so please do not take this as something that is set in stone. And I hope that we'll get interesting feedback from you throughout the discussion. But we've tried to split our definition of integrity up in 3 dimensions. And you will note an adjective there at the top, the ideally, as we've actually faced the situation that in reality it is highly unlikely that all of these 3 dimensions will be completely fulfilled if we're talking about different stakeholders. But the first dimension is at the level of individual partners. They should be trustworthy, credible, and accountable. And I'll try to explain what these still abstract words mean in further detail. But here it's really about the different individuals that come to sit around the table. The next dimension is looking at the processes and the decision making. So basically everything that governs partnerships. Is that set up in a way that is transparent, inclusive, and responsive, and that helps to balance out the different power imbalances that you always find in these partnerships? And lastly, and this is an interesting point for discussion, I would say, we've said we want to see clear objectives and demonstrable outcomes that advance sustainable water management. So here, what we're trying to tease out a bit is there actually really a credible intention of doing something good at the end, and are people trying to also show that? But to try breaking that down a bit further, I'll present you a few of the things that we came across. Don't worry, you don't need to read the whole table, and I won't read it neither. That we came across when doing assessments in 3 different countries up to now. Under this project, what we've done is we've done a desk review, and we've done field assessments in South Africa, Tanzania, and Peru. So this is the basis for the information that I'll tell you. And what you see in the table is basically a few risk areas that we've tentatively identified under these 3 dimensions. And I'll just highlight a few to get you a bit of a better feel what we're talking about, together with some quotes that we got in this field work. So first question is, of course, why do the different individual partners engage in such initiatives? And here's where we need to stop talking about private sector engagement, but really look at who are the different public, civil society, and private sector actors that are engaging. And I think the quote is something that is probably not very surprising, but is also something that is quite telling in the sense that it's a perception of a certain actor. And we'll have to distinguish there also a bit what of this is facts and what of it isn't. So here somebody said they just go where the money comes from. If it's not personally profitable or politically useful, they're not interested. And guess what? This is, of course, addressed towards the government. Representation, I think, is another very important point, just to pick out another one from this individual dimension, where there's a bit of a dogma that once you put a couple of NGOs or civil society organizations into a room, that you have legitimacy and a representation of what the broader civil society thinks and what their interests are. And yeah, this is also something that needs to be scrutinized well. Not saying that it can't be the case. There's other things, and you will surely see a report at one point that describes all of this. But moving a bit on to what we look at as the governance of these partnerships, what we've seen in many cases is that actually the planning and design of such partnership initiatives is something that in its nature is very complicated, but that also leads to a number of flaws, and that sometimes leads to situations where very fundamental questions are not being asked. So is it actually the right thing to do? But also, who are you doing it with, and how are you setting up the processes to make it happen? So here's just another example. I won't read it out. You can hopefully had enough time while I mumble here to quickly go through it. Another one is the point of stakeholder analysis, which in itself is a process, but here the quote is pointing more to the point of actual stakeholder engagement. So in the first place, looking at who needs to be involved, who are the actors who can potentially be marginalized, but then also making sure that they're actually being engaged throughout the process, and that you do not end up with this, with something that I think is also very natural dynamic, that you have three people who do a lot of work and then keep on running, but you lose half of your team on the way. So that's another critical point, because this is, at the end of the day, a lot about the legitimacy of the initiative, and that safeguarding that legitimate interests are being taken into account. Fiduciary risk and financial management, here's where I come to the core area of work of WIN. This is, of course, where it's the most direct that money can get lost, or we would call it direct corruption. And aside from the fact that money can get lost, it's also important to note that here again, mere perception can cause a lot of damage to an initiative. So this is again something where quite a bit of thought needs to be put into this. Moving now on to where these initiatives want to move at. Here I didn't bring any example from the field on the question of whether such an initiative actually contributes to sustainable water management. So here, this is really looking at what is the purpose, what are the drivers behind the initiative. And this is something that from the field assessments made it very clear that this determines very much who needs to be around the table and where specific attention and scrutiny needs to be shored. Capture at various different levels is something that can simply always happen when you bring people together that meet on a personal level, build up relationships, and then use these. And just here an example of how priorities are being set in reality sometimes. But also when you look at regulatory and policy capture, there's a risk that if you bring in very powerful actors with also very clear ideas on what water policy should look like, that you may put them into a position where they're actually being asked to make policy. And this is something that we've also seen in some cases, which is something that needs to be looked at basically, and where such initiatives need to see what can be done to make sure that interests are balanced, because it's not per se wrong that private actors bring in their expertise and also their interests, right? And lastly, also looking at capture of the resources of water. This just to make it a bit more concrete what we're talking about, but again, now I would like to just very quickly focus you on what we want to do with this initiative is not evaluate any of these projects, and please keep that in mind, that also all of these findings are not related to the same project or to projects of the same organization. But what we now want to focus on in the project is develop a very constructive and pragmatic approach of how this can be handled. And throughout the consultations, we've come across a number of things that we think are important more generally to take into consideration. I'll run you through them briefly. First and foremost important thing, if you bring in an abstract new topic, we need to make sure that we link it directly to the management and performance of an initiative and do not create add-ons to the work of people who are already overburdened. And this is then again also very closely linked to the point of making sure that we actually point out what the benefits are of increasing integrity. And here's just a couple of examples. This is basically what we condensed a few interviews down to. Increase effectiveness of achieving the initiative's goals, earning credibility and reducing reputational risks, fostering long-term engagement and cooperation. Just to give one example, but what people mention frequently, you work with a mayor, you have a new election, and once you have a new mayor, the dirt comes to the surface and you have to clean up. So it's really an opportunity to make sure that you can actually position yourself on the market for corporate actor in the long run, but also for other actors to make sure that there's continued cooperation. And lastly, also make sure that you support your staff and you reduce risks of prosecution. So many times it's unexperienced staff that is responsible or fulfills some kind of role in such initiatives, and just clarifying what is okay and what is not okay helps them to do their job no matter which actor they're coming from. One more minute. Lastly, just quickly, the other point is nobody is really an expert on this topic, so when it comes to more complex issues, we can't expect that people come up with solutions when they dedicate a day in a year to the topic. And since it is a sensitive topic, we need to make sure that actually these integrity issues are managed jointly. I was asked to be a bit more provocative or to provoke some discussion, so I'll skip the first couple of points, but what is quite key in this whole process is that we rethink the way how we try to approach lots of these complex problems with total participation. That basically you throw a problem at people that in the context that they are supposed to address it simply cannot do it because it's too complex. So what we're going to try doing with this project, therefore, is to make sure that we clarify what must be in place. So what are the minimum standards that initiatives actually need to adhere to? But then we need to, of course, make sure that there is participation and that we build up ownership. So what we need to do there is we need to provide guidance and we need to explain people what they can do for specific problems. So we need to provide them with a menu card of different solutions and then allow them to pick what they think is the right thing to do. So that just as one way of thinking, and here's a bit of a graphic of what we envisage to do. So we plan to develop a guideline and combine that with a series of practical exercises which start from the process of developing the initiative and then go into continuous management approach. Maybe to stop, here's a couple of questions as food for thought for the discussion.
Great. Great. Yeah, thanks. Fabulous. Some very tasty and interesting and heavy food for thought there. To help us digest that, we've assembled a corporate engagement on water dragon's den of a legally minded water expert, a social scientist, and a business person. And I think quite a good panel to give those initiatives the reality check, the laugh test. So I'll introduce first Chris Olam, who's Sustainability Manager for... Sorry. Chris Brown. Chris Brown. It's not your company, is it? Chris Brown, Sustainability Manager for Olam. I'd never really heard of Olam until I met Chris, and they're one of the world's leading sources and suppliers of coffee, cocoa, rice, edible nuts, working in 65 countries from seed to shelf.
Seed to shelf, yeah.
So very well qualified to reflect on what we've just heard from a somebody who's faced with dealing with these water risks and challenges on a day-to-day practical basis. So about 3 to 5 minutes on whether you're in or out on these, on your perspectives on what you just heard.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, hope you managed to stay awake through my bit, because otherwise you'll miss out on these two following me. Thanks, Nick. Olam, yeah, again, unless you do business with us, you've probably not heard of us, but we're one of the top 7 global agribusinesses. Customers that we count very highly on our list are Unilever, Nestle, Walmart, Ferrero, the list goes on. If you consume coffee, cocoa, you'll be consuming some of our products. So if you eat 8 chocolate bars anywhere in the world, one of them, the cocoa, will have come from ourselves. So just to give you an idea of scale, and also some of the, with scale comes some of the issues. So we work with about 4 million smallholder farmers, many of which are in Africa, Asia, increasingly in Latin America, all facing quite tough times. Most of these smallholder farmers are subsistence plus a bit more that they sell on to us. They're typically farming 1 to 2 hectares of land. So when Tony was talking about the water going into farmers globally, this is the reality of farming. Unless you get into grains coming out of the US, Canada, Ukraine, but most farming comes from smallholders. So their capacity, ability, or whatever word we want to use, to cope with the problems they face is much diminished, because their start point is one of poverty. So whilst I'm Environmental Sustainability Manager, I'm under no illusions that the problem that we've got to tackle first relates to poverty. Water can support lifting farmers out of poverty, but again, it's just one of a myriad of different factors, and depending on where farmers are located, obviously that risk can be greater or less. And this is one of the challenges facing business. And David this morning from Saab Miller was talking about their approaches. So leading companies are increasingly recognising the risks, the direct risks posed to their business, and the indirect risks or dependent risks that also impact on their businesses. In the same way that water is typically in the supply chain, so therefore are the water risks. So there's a degree of separation with farming companies, agribusiness, to deal directly with the issues at hand. So again, the example that David gave about looking at things within your boundary fence is fine, but again, the real issues are beyond that, and the dependent risks are huge. So looking at the 3 points that were given, one about standards, one about integrity, and CDP. Standards, I'm really welcoming of standards, really welcoming the guidance it can give us at a practical level, the transferability and scalability that allows us to take forward. There are questions about how do you apply that in the supply chain when faced with 4 million smallholder farmers. It's nigh impossible to do that ourselves, which then takes you into the world of partnerships, collaborations with NGOs, with donors, with development finance institutions, with government. So in those collaborations, there's got to be a high degree of integrity. One of the challenges we face is it's quite often very difficult to plan and design a partnership. You will have to deal at some stage with communities. You will have to deal at some stage with regulators, with either good regulation or poor regulation, or good governance or no governance. And you'll have to deal with government and all the various dependencies that they have to manage themselves to ensure that country operates in one way, shape or form. So integrity in partnerships is something that we've sort of more by look than judgment. We've muddled our way through a few partnerships. Again, Tanzania seems to be a bit of a hot topic. We've currently got a a very good partnership in an area of Tanzania where we have a coffee plantation, and we've had invited the water ministry, local communities of the water users to come and form a water users association. It looked a bit of a disparate bunch when we first walked into the room, trying to say, this is what we need to do, this is how we need to manage water within this river basin. Until we got one of the actors walk in, who was a local nun. Now the nuns ran a run-of-river hydropower plant just down the way from our coffee plantation. So hugely important for them that we were managing water effectively, because we are the largest off-taker of water. As soon as the nun walked into the room, everybody else sort of came to the table. So in terms of integrity, having somebody that has that integrity and has that power to pull people together it's absolutely invaluable. It was amazing to see. I don't think we'll be that lucky to find nuns wherever we go, but this was amazing. CDP, again, wholly support CDP's approach. The work they've done on carbon has changed the face with regards to business approaches to climate change. Water's very different. Water is a very, very complex puzzle to solve, as we're all aware. I couldn't do Cate's job because I just wouldn't be up to it. She's got some amazing challenges to face and get across, and they're making huge strides towards that. What I'd really like to see CDP do is motivate the investor community. Business will, if there's value, business will motivate themselves. So if there is shareholder value, all good business will move forward. But it's the investor community. If the drivers are there from the investors, if the right signals are coming out from the investment community that this information is meaningful to them, and I believe it is for our business, so we do participate and we'll support CDP in along with a lot of other companies moving this forward. We'll do that, but I want to understand if are we gathering the right information for investors? What's going to create the change for them? And also just a very simple question, are they really smart enough to understand all of the varying degrees of risk associated with water, when a lot of it is about dependent risk, which drills down to poverty and livelihoods, particularly for businesses in the agricultural sector? So that's just a bit of a taster on thoughts from me.
Great stuff. Thanks, Chris. Over to Suvi Sojamo, who is a researcher at Aalto University in Finland, studying virtual water trade internationally, and founder of the Corporate Water Research Network.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Hello, everyone, from my behalf. As said, I'm a PhD researcher at the Water and Development Research Group at Aalto University in Helsinki, Finland. I'm also a Water Witness Associate, working with Nick on these issues internationally, and a research fellow at the University of East Anglia Water Security Research Centre. But I'm here representing CWRN, one more acronym for you, which is the Corporate Water Research Network that we launched last Friday with UEA, Water Security Centre, and Water Witness. And we had some 25 bright minds, mostly from the UK research institutions, WWF, WaterAid, CDP, ODI in the room, but we are definitely welcoming more partners and participants. So the aim of the network basically is to strengthen the research effort on corporate engagement of water and corporate water stewardship. And what we are aiming to contribute towards is a more robust evidence base, conceptualization, clarity on terminology, and actual validation of needs and impacts on the ground of corporate engagement of water. And very much addressing the questions of legitimacy and equity in that regard. And being a researcher, I do have a couple of questions for the speakers. And I think this is both for Cate and Sabine, but on actual validation and verification of the disclosure claims and of the actions the corporations are claiming to make, how do you actually verify those on a continuous basis as well? And maybe more to Sabine on the institutional alignment, especially outside the EU, of the stewardship standard? How do you ensure that, and how do you ensure local ownership? And on the other hand, especially in developing settings, how do you ensure that you're not just contributing to sort of like standardization burden that might actually affect these small-scale farmers and sort of like, still support the already privileged ones, but the ones who are not there yet, if this is actually something which is too much for them. And I think Janek sort of stole my questions, but I would have a very practical one for you, that like, because these are still just guidelines. How do we actually ensure uptake and implementation and real impact? That's pretty much it.
Well, that's an easy one.
Suvi. Fabulous. Do you want to come back on those questions now, or shall we save them? Do you want some time to mull them over? Okay. Well, let's respond to those points. Unfortunately, Sabine's got to get to the airport at 5:30, so. Train.
Good. So we're far away from the airport, so we get 10 minutes.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that is that's really an interesting question, and I have to admit I can only answer it partly, because a standard is and stays an administrative burden. It's an investment, and the question is who is putting the capacity in this investment. So is it just said what we see sometimes, that the top of the supply chain says either you do it or you don't, you are out of my supply chain? Or is the supply chain taking also responsibility? And here we come back. That is one level where I see here an answer to your question. I mentioned the investment and the consumer level. In a way, we talk about capacities, human capacities, and it ends up with who is remunerating that. So what we really need to create, and that is still a gap, is a kind of a consumer awareness for water equity, for example, that then retailers, for example, can take also a premium price for that. We have that, for example, for social standards, where that has functioned very well. We don't have that at the moment. Then, on the other hand, within the supply chain, what we do is we do a lot of awareness raising, because from our understanding, I mean, you have two issues with water. You have, for example, a supply chain, citrus fruit producers in the North African regions, or strawberry producers, and you can say, okay, they are there. They won't be sustainable straight ahead. You can't make them sustainable water managers straight ahead, because there are systems in place that are definitely not sustainable. So water stewardship is a way to improve the sustainability of the water management. So, and the standard helps you to show to your clients, hey guys, we know we have gaps here, we know that the production is still not as it should be ideally, but we are on the way, and we have a defined system, a transparent system, and we show the improvement of these groups instead of pushing them out of the supply chains.
Great. Then you guys, 1 minute if you can on implementation, and 1 minute for you on verification.
Yes.
I want to open us up to...
Can I ask Sabine a question before she goes?
Well, we're happy to wait.
Anarchy.
Well, I guess I'm happy to wait.
She's just about to go, so can I ask a quick question?
Of course.
Thank you.
I hope I find a quick answer.
No, sure. It's about the Europe bit. Because if we're looking at stewardship beyond the factory fence, I mean, just as the stewardship standard looks a very good code, and I've read through it, and it looks a very comprehensive and good code. But in Europe, there are comprehensive codes that exist. You know, you mentioned the Water Framework Directive, but there's a lot of other regulation around that, and you have regulators that are busy. So the Environment Agency and even Ofwat in this country. So why Europe? I mean, in terms of governance gap, you said there's interesting questions to ask in Europe, but people in this room working in other countries would say there's a lot of more interesting questions to ask elsewhere. So why Europe? Are you piloting in Europe, and is your main focus elsewhere? I think that's an important thing to sort of clarify for us.
Well, I thank you for the question. I would answer it in two parts, because first of all, we have critical issues in Europe. Go in all Mediterranean countries, we have problems with saltwater intrusion. I'm coming from Belgium. The region of Antwerp, Flanders have saltwater intrusion. Northern countries have a lot of problems with pollution, mainly coming from the agricultural sector. The region of Lower Saxony in Germany, closing down wells because of too high nitrate levels, and so on and so on. So this is always a bit my reply, especially to supply chain managers who say, I recently met a big retail group from the UK who said, yeah, in Europe we are safe. And then I said, well, how many shops did you close down in the UK for the floods? And don't you have any products in your shelves that have been, like grapes or so, that have been produced in the Mediterranean or in Greece or in Cyprus? So we have issues. And for the policy side, we have definitely a problem, and that has been addressed this morning in the empowerment, in the implementation of our legislation. The legislation is in place, and I think around the world where you have legislation, the issue might be similar. That's not only in Europe. That is why we have a lot of policymakers in. The EEA has been developing with us the standard, and we are working also closely with the DG Environment, with the Commission, because they say you can't only come with the carrot and the legislation. We need also private sectors, the front runners who take and who trigger activities. And a second thing is definitely as a seat of or the location of a lot of headquarters of corporate internationals, the EU is an entry point. And I would say, please use the EU as an entry point also. You know, sometimes it's easier to start in for example, we worked in the agro-food sector. They started in production sites within Europe, and now they spread out globally.
Okay.
Sorry, Nick.
Thanks,
Back to your agenda.
So, 30 seconds, if you will.
30 seconds. I had a minute.
A minute, come on.
Okay. Thanks, Sabine. So on the verification of the disclosure itself, CDP, we've got 120 members of staff, so we don't go and do our own external third-party verification of any of the disclosures that are made to us. But we do reward companies that do have elements of their disclosure verified. At this stage, with regards to water, we would expect the accounting level information that companies provide to us to be verified by an external party. But of course, we know that that's got limitations to actually proving impact reduction. So it's an area that we're exploring over the next few years, and we've begun a project with the TNC and Pacific Institute to look at how can a company effectively measure the effectiveness of the contribution that they're making or the action that they're taking. So it's a very interesting question, something that we're looking into now, but we rely more heavily on and reward companies that take third-party verification. And I'll answer or come back to investors another time, or whenever we're ready.
We'll come back to that.
On how to make sure that corporate actors, but also these partnership initiatives actually take up the ideas of integrity, I think is actually really not such a difficult answer. First of all, I think it can generate very tangible benefits. Just to give you two examples, there's a company in the Netherlands that is called, or an international company in the Netherlands that's called Royal Dutch Haskening, has around 8,000 or 9,000 employees. They've put in place a very rigid integrity management strategy. They've pulled out of, I think, up to 5 countries or something like that, because they weren't able to live up to their standards there. By now, they've managed to increase their revenue drastically, because it has actually generated a USP for them. It's their market advantage. We've seen something similar now with a pilot project in Kenya with water utilities, where by systematically integrating integrity considerations, the first company after 6 months has now reported to us that they've increased their revenues. You are welcome to question the how do you call it? Yeah, the causality, exactly. But I think what is very crucial to achieve that is that we do not put the spotlight on integrity, but that we actually look at the subject, which is in our case a water stewardship initiative. And I think there's 2 main elements to that. One, the process of establishing it, and then the actual initiative, and that I think needs to be described in the first place. And we need to understand what it is. And if you understand that people sit around the table and talk, and that's one of the main activities, then you can start thinking about, okay, where do you need to put in place safeguards? And then it's becoming, you know, maybe do not always only let two people talk, but try to bring in others.
Talking of bringing in others, I think we don't want to be accused of capturing the time of the civil society panel later today. So Peter, if you can give us 2 quick points, and then we'll open it up to the group. Or have you?
No, fine. Questions or points? Up to you.
Points followed by questions, and we'll see if they.
Okay.
We've got time to address those.
Sure. I mean, one of the things that struck me from the CDP report, your 2013 report, was this issue of board supervision. To what extent are the boards of these companies actually following this story? And I noticed that in the survey you did globally, you said that 58% of companies, the boards, were following water management issues and water stewardship type policies. Now, in the series report that's just come out of US companies, there was a much lower percentage of 32%. Now, companies are very different in different countries, and each company is a bit different. I mean, Chris has just explained how Olam fits into that picture. So it's a very heterogeneous sort of picture, and I wonder how we can unpack some of those differences. I mean, you're going to score companies to push them forward, and you're using different tools to facilitate and stimulate better performance. I wonder whether you're splitting companies by country, and I wonder if people have comments in the floor about how to watch and how to sort of inspire, for example, British companies. DFID is going to support an initiative. What about British companies based in London? Are they performing better in this regard than US companies? It might not be so difficult, but you know, what is the picture? That's one question I have. Differentiating between different companies in different countries.
Yes. Great, thank you, Peter. So CDP, we do have information of companies right across the world, and that number of the number of companies that disclose to us every year is increasing. For the one report that you read, that was focused on the global 500 companies, so they're sort of scattered all over the world. But we have country-specific reports where we look at the state of play within that country. So there is a US report, there's a South Africa and Australia report where we compare them generally to the sort of the global 500 as a benchmark. We are this year for the first time inviting UK headquartered companies to disclose to us. And we're thinking about ways in which we can present all of this data in a way that can be easily analysed online, so you can see how UK companies compare to the rest, as an example. But that function is available for you.
Okay. I think it's important.
Great. Okay, well, thanks. I warned you that I was a worse chair than Roger, and I was right. We've reached the our time limit, but we don't want to be accused of tyranny of just us telling you stuff. So can we eat 10, 15 minutes into the half-hour coffee break? Is that 10, 15?
Well, ask the audience there. Coffee break.
Let's see how eager you are to fire questions at us. So let's take 3 questions. Robin, you've had your hand up. David?
Yeah.
Yep.
So sorry, just to build on what Janek was saying as well, one of the reasons GIZ is so keen to support the work on integrity here is that what we feel we've seen in these partnerships over the last 4 years, the 12 or so that we've been involved in, is that they sort of come together in very different ways and turn out in very different ways, and you don't really know how that's going to happen. And there's one of the things that we've asked the team to do is actually go out to our partnerships and really take a critical look at our partnerships and give us very concrete recommendations to embed. So going to that point of how will these recommendations be taken up, well, immediately there's a program hungry for the results, because we want to sort of build that into our best operating practice, and also again linking to the wider sort of learning on that. So look, and the other thing is that there's just very many different things going on in stewardship. So for example, we talked to an international NGO recently about doing an economic study in a river basin in Africa. We said, fantastic, sounds like a really good idea. Let's involve the Water Resource Management Authority that's just been created. It will be a fantastic first project for them, and we'll get their buy-in. Oh no, that will take too long, and that sounds like CWRN, let's do it without them. So you think, well, is that actually strengthening governance, or is that weakening governance? And if the purpose or the rhetoric of that NGO is to contribute to water policy and it's going ahead in parallel or neglecting, likewise with companies. Headquarters of a company recently, again, talking to them about their water strategy, and it comes down to, at the end, the meaty bit is, oh, we're going to do lots of projects with NGOs in the catchments. And I said, well, you haven't mentioned the public sector once in your whole presentation. How would I feel if I was the water resource manager of this or this basin or of this country, and I saw your presentation? I'd be like, well, you're completely ignoring the mandated users. So it's just a point there of why this work is so important for us, because it will help give us guidance on these types of issues as well.
Dave.
Dave Tickner from WWF. Quick question for Cate, I think. We're beginning to see the beginnings of perhaps a divestment movement from the fossil fuel sector, partly based on stranded asset perceptions. To what extent do you think we might begin to see something similar in terms of investors divesting from certain companies because of potential stranded assets around water?
I think we're still a little way away from that. And to be honest, CDP doesn't promote so vociferously divestment. I think we very much want active participation in the way in which these companies are managed and governed, taken forward. The moment an investor removes its investment from the company, arguably at this stage, it probably will be replaced by a less concerned investor. So we very much would advocate against that in the first instance. What we're seeing right now is the investors are prioritising their activities, their engagements with non-disclosing companies. So they know that water risk is a complex issue. They know that actually the only way in which they can help and hope to understand it is if they've got better data. They want to make sure that the companies themselves fully understand what a water risk is, how it's driven, and what it means for their business and their success. So we've just had a stream of letters released today by Boston Common Asset Management, for example. There's around 25 that they issued to their top portfolio companies, Adidas, Costco, demanding that they disclose to us so that then they can make a more informed decision. They've got the information at hand so that they can then begin engaging on a much more proactive way around, okay, so now that you have disclosed, what now? And I think we're still at the very early stages of the let's get everybody in the car, ready for the journey, and then they'll support them along that journey.
Great.
Has that answered your question? Okay.
John.
John Seago. Just a quick question, I think, which builds on Peter's question earlier. And I was just wondering how these stewardship and integrity approaches, which are essentially voluntary approaches, sit with regulation. Businesses, they might not like regulation, but what they do say is that it does give them certainty against which they can plan and invest. And I was just wondering if you could give us a comment on that, how you see the relationship between the two and working together.
So are you talking about, so for CDP, the role of disclosure and reporting and aligning that with regulation?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
So in the UK, take an example, we just saw the introduction of mandatory corporate carbon reporting. CDP are very much sort of supporting DEFRA in the development of that piece of legislation. And it was felt that the work that CDP did on encouraging companies to report and disclose this information in a much more broader context, rather than just how much energy you're consuming, but also what does that mean, has made it easier to introduce that sort of legislation here in the UK. We're working with a number of different policymakers and governments around the world to explore the implementation and the implications of mandatory corporate water reporting. What does that mean, and how can we encourage that? In terms of the data that is disclosed to us, regulatory risk is probably the highest risk that most companies disclose to us, whether that's inadequate legislation, poorly enforced, or a serious lack of it. It's a very a pertinent point that certainly investors are also incredibly aware of.
Maybe I could respond on behalf of Sabine and the Alliance of Water Stewardship. It's very much positioned as not to replace legislation, but to supplement it and support its implementation. So for example, the standard will check whether a company is complying with local legislation, which is incredibly important in some countries where the regulatory capacity and will to do that just simply doesn't exist. Sorry, Roger. But that, that's true. In some places, there aren't the feet on the ground to go and monitor and enforce compliance with local legislation around water. What the standard does is a third party audits whether that's happening or not, and recognises and differentiates that water steward in the marketplace.
Andrew Ross from Global Gardens. So really a question for Cate and also for Chris at Olam. The EU non-financial reporting directive came out last month, which is requiring sustainability reporting throughout the whole supply chain of all corporates in the EU over $2 million euro turnover. The key question has always been for these corporates that this is an externality outside their balance sheet reporting and therefore their shareholders and investor interest. On the other hand, you've got key investors like Aviva behind lobbying for sustainability reporting and successfully bringing this legislation, and they're behind introducing exactly the same text into the post-2015 SDGs. So the investor interest here is very clear. Now, the question is, how do you think at CDP you can magically connect commodities at risk, forests being destroyed, water being lost, with a balance sheet asset?
That's a great question. Thank you, Andrew. CDP has, we are doing it already. So CDP has, it was very exciting to see the announcement of this policy sort of passing through the EU. It's our bread and butter really at CDP. So the more that this reporting is integrated into financial reporting is a huge success for us. And we support it wholeheartedly. It doesn't mean that CDP no longer has a job to do. I think there are various limits as to what is reported, what data points will be asked for across the EU is really an interesting conversation that we're involved with and supporting. CDP has a sister project called CDSB, and it's the Climate Disclosure Standards Board. And they've now, like ourselves, they've dropped the climate and they've just become this CDSB because they've expanded their framework to cover water and deforestation. And it's a framework for any organisation that's putting their financial reports together that clearly indicates where and how to integrate climate, water and deforestation or commodity risk information into that financial framework. And so we're sort of wholeheartedly advertising and pushing that out into the marketplace at this stage. It's currently available for public consultation on our website. So if you'd like to have a look at that and see sort of how strong it is, if you've got comments that you'd like to make them, then please go ahead and do that. But that's our vehicle for ensuring the magic success of this initiative.
Where does the valuation come from that investors can make judgments on?
So you mean in terms of the value at risk?
The money. Where do you find a particular target in money terms?
So the value of water to a business, for example?
This whole matrix.
Right.
It's got to be tangible to an investor in terms of how they're making a decision.
It does. So we look at a range of financial indicators, not particularly with water. I think it's a bit clearer with overall sort of share price and carbon. There's a clearer links. Be better at managing your footprint, and you're likely to be spending less money, and therefore your share price will be more stable. Water, it's a little more convoluted, a little bit more complex, and a little bit more muddy. So we look at a range of other financial indicators such as return on investment, capex, opex, and we're trying to draw these connections between good water stewardship and strong financial performance. And then that work will expand over the next few years to cover all three themes ideally. But it's a work in progress. It's difficult though.
I think we've time for one more question, unless everyone's desperate for coffee and tea.
Well, can I just make a comment to that? I mean, isn't that the biggest question of all? Because otherwise, if that doesn't work, you then have to look at different forms of companies, and there are different forms of companies which, in their constitution, mandate directors of companies to to take account of other things beyond just profit.
That's entirely voluntary.
It
There's
i-
still no metric.
Well, I'll leave that. But if at least if you've got the mission of the company, which is geared in a different way, you solve one problem. But I do think the entry point at the moment has to be through the business and finance to see how far the stewardship, as Cate says, actually links, and to what extent these risks really are shared.
It can be explained as well. I mean, just touching on that, I had a conversation yesterday with the head of our Californian Olam business. So in the business review meeting with the CEO, monthly meeting, they reflect on, in effect, what the impact of water has been on the business. So internally we do that, and then the investors, the market will see what the impact has been through the profitability of that business. So whilst there's no definitive metric at the moment that we put out there to say this is what the impact of water has been, if you look at a high water risk aspect of anyone's business, and you look at what has the change been in a particular period, let's take a season for agriculture. If a company can explain why there's been an increase or a decrease that adequately accounts for that change, be it including the effect of water or climate or social unrest due to availability of water, sanitation, whatever it might be, as long as that explanation is there, that an investor can understand the reasons for either an increase or a decrease, then that's a good way forward at the moment. We're, along with many other companies, looking at this. Up in Edinburgh a short while ago, talking about natural capital valuation. So we're engaged like a number of companies on this. And again, as Kate's described, there's momentum, and it's around making this understood within each business, and making it valid for each business, because every business is different. So a universal cost for water just wouldn't work. So it's got to be applied. It's got to be applied specific to a location or a product or whatever it might be. But these are things to determine. And again, there's momentum moving in that direction.
Great. Tony?
I can't resist. Thank you very much. Clearly, consumers should be leading this, but consumers, bless them, are determined to eat themselves to death or whatever. Corporates are clearly very important, and investors are very important. Can I, maybe half a dozen people in the room who could answer this, I can't myself, who's in the lead, the investors or the corporates? I hope it's the investors.
Or the consumers.
I mean, CDP's work on water was started as a result, in a sense, of investor interest. They saw the power. They saw that this risk was coming. I guess NBIM, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, and JP Morgan were sort of instrumental in kickstarting the water program. The number of investor signatories to the program is more than quadrupled in the last 4 years. We started off with a measly 16 trillion, and we're now up at 63 trillion. There is an appetite amongst that community, I think, to better understand the implications of water on their portfolio companies. They don't have all the answers, but they're calling for the data. And companies, as Chris rightly said, I think I'm working from the Kevin Costner theory of if you build it, they will come. If we get these investors into the Olympic Stadium that CDP has built, the companies will come and compete, and we're proving that already, I think, and we will continue to endeavour to upskill the investors and support them in their endeavours to fully understand what this means for them. They're a very powerful lever.
I'd argue business is leading.
Sorry?
I'd argue business is leading.
Well, you don't see the data that we get.
Unfortunately, I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. This is very much a live debate. We established the Corporate Water Research Network to host that debate and to pose and help answer some of the difficult questions and important questions that this whole agenda flushes out. So if you're interested in being kept in touch or getting involved with that, see Suvi or myself. Thanks very much to our panellists and our discussants, and to ODI for giving us the space to have this discussion. Thanks to you all for your attention. Great.